Good morning, everyone. Today we have Jake Schogger with us. Based in England, Jake is a best-selling author, entrepreneur, copywriter, consultant, and legal advisor. He specializes in working with startups and scale-ups to effectively define their value propositions, articulate compelling stories, and develop targeted marketing strategies that can be successfully communicated with the stakeholders. In the past, he has also worked with Freshviews. Further, Jake is the founder of the Commercial Law Academy, which is an e-learning platform for aspiring commercial lawyers that offers helpful videos, downloadable guides, and exclusive guidance from industry experts and qualified lawyers. At this point, I recommend you check out Jake's LinkedIn profile, which is displayed on your screen now, to learn more about him. Welcome, Jake. Thank you for sitting down with us today. Today's interview is designed to give aspiring lawyers an insight into what the legal industry looks like for people who aren't lawyers, but still provide legal services such as consulting and more, as do you. And in doing so is also designed to demonstrate the path students can take to achieving a similar career path. With that, I'll hand it over to my colleagues so we can get started.
Welcome, Jake. So let's start from the very beginning, which is your education. So how would you describe your university experience as?
I had a really great time. I studied law and business. I didn't really know what law involved, but I enjoyed studying business in high school, so I kind of combined them. I found some of it really interesting, but it was kind of the broader university life that I loved, which I guess is quite typical. So I was heavily involved in extracurricular activities, but more because I was interested in getting involved rather than specifically boosting my CV. I think anyone at university should use their time to at least have a go at everything that interests them, as many of those opportunities won't be so sort of readily and cheaply available once you leave. So I played drums in a big band and a smaller jazz band. I ran a commercial law society and a finance society. I attended these awesome government-funded study programs in China and India, played football and tennis, even though I wasn't particularly good at either. I even attended an American football training session once, but probably won't elaborate on that anymore. But just wanted to see what it was like. And throughout, I also worked part-time teaching drum kit so that I could afford to kind of travel throughout my summers. So actually talking about summers, enjoy your long summers while you can, because once you start work, you'll look back and you just won't be able to believe in retrospect how much time you actually had off as a student. So I definitely made the most of those, but I had to work to make that possible. Now, some people say, well, I want to get involved in societies or I want to do stuff, but they hit some kind of barrier or something goes wrong. But where that happens, find a way around it. I mean, I was rejected when I tried out for the men's football team, so I set up a casual five-a-side team. I was rejected when I ran in an election to join the law society, so I co-founded a different society myself, so I had that experience of building and running something. And actually, building and running a society turned out to be a lot like running a business. You're like developing branding and marketing and offering, you're recruiting a team, raising funding through sponsorship, budgeting, and in that sense, all of my kind of fun university experiences helped a huge amount when it came to me then setting up my own first business. So yeah, that was kind of me and my university experience in a nutshell.
Makes sense. Wow, it was really wow. So what is something you would have done differently during your university years?
Probably would have explored other careers in more detail, including other types of legal careers. And I think I got sort of into this one-track mind about commercial law in the city because it seemed like that's what everyone else was doing, and the firms that could afford to come to campus and kind of offer us drinks and food and presentations were the big firms because they had the budgets to do it. And it meant I closed myself off pretty quickly to careers in kind of consulting, maybe working with startups and creative industries and all that kind of thing. I mean, it's worked out well in the end, but it took a lot of work and networking and rebranding myself to get to where I am now. So I think just using that opportunity to look at other types of careers and, would have maybe been something I would have done differently. But generally, I have no regrets about university, and it's really helped me to get to where I am now.
Yeah. So what would you say was the most challenging aspect of your university life in particular?
Probably the academic side, which I know is a bit of a ridiculous thing to say because you're going to university first and foremost to get a degree. But I think balancing my studies alongside all those extracurriculars and working part-time, and then towards the end of my degree, setting up a business, that was a challenge. And I wouldn't say I was an example student. Luckily, I came out with a 2-1 in the end, but there were some hairy moments with a few modules where I got to my exam revision period and didn't really know what was going on. Luckily, my now wife, who we met on our course and we studied together, she saved me a few times by teaching me some stuff almost from scratch. But that was just pot luck on my side, that she was a much better student than I was. So I think that was the most challenging thing, trying to strike that right balance.
Perfect. Well, so that's all about the education aspect of the questions. Now I will hand it over to Khadija.
Thank you, Wafia. So let's talk about the next chapter of your life, which is your career. What made you choose law as a career?
I guess it was a load of different things building up. So when students say to me, I really struggle to articulate my career motivation for legal careers, I usually say to them, go back to the very first thing that sparked the idea of potentially being a lawyer in your mind. So for me, and this is sort of the truth, I used to be in a band full time from the age of 18 to 23. And we got a very small record deal in a gap year I'd taken for a totally different degree in university. And I remember being in a room, being taken through that record deal by a lawyer and thinking what they were doing was quite interesting. They were talking about something complicated, explaining the risks to us. It seemed like a very human and social thing to be doing. And I found that pretty interesting. So I then applied or asked that firm if I could do a day's work experience with them and got a much better idea of what lawyers did. I was quite attracted to the idea of using language to mitigate risk, inform persuasive arguments. I was very interested in the kind of client-facing elements and client management. And that was the first thing that really sparked my interest. Now, there were elements of my degree, the more problem-solving focused modules like contract law and commercial law and tort law that I really enjoyed. But I guess the reason I did law and business degree was I liked business and wanted to mix it up, but there were elements of the law modules I liked. So with all that in mind, when I started going to firm presentations, partly at the beginning just to get free food and drink, but when I went to these presentations, I found them really interesting. I realized they had those problem-solving aspects and that kind of risk mitigation and that focus on language. I also learned that there were really great training opportunities. It's a well-structured career. There's great opportunities to learn and develop. And then more specifically, commercial law, because it had that business focus. And I always had that interest in business. So that was kind of my journey into it. And I think if anyone is trying to articulate their own journey, tell your story. It'll come across as more authentic. By explaining what you've done to learn more about the career, you're going to be more persuasive when you say that there are certain aspects like the intellectual challenge or whatever that really appeal. And that's certainly the case for me.
That's very interesting. So as Jashan mentioned previously, you worked at Freshfields. Could you describe how that was?
Yeah, so really, really great training. We had multiple training sessions a week, sometimes at the trainee level, sometimes team-specific training, sometimes firm-specific sessions. So there were so many opportunities to learn, just to learn about the types of documents we would see in the processes we'd been managing and all that kind of stuff. And that meant I never really felt totally overwhelmed and out of my depth, which was great. I learned a lot. I think I learned a lot more than I gave the firm credit for when I left. Nowadays I can pick up legal concepts, even if I'm working with documents I've never seen before, much more quickly. I understand how contracts fit together, and I think the foundational training Freshfields gave me was great for that. They had lots of interesting clients and kind of really high profile confidential deals and cases and stuff they were working on. So being part of that was interesting. And generally just some really great people. I mean, some of my best friends today, 3 years later, are people I met through the training contracts. So yeah, in that sense, it was a really good experience. Of course, you have long hours at times, and there were times I left the office at 4 a.m. and needed to be back in at sort of 9 a.m. the next day and working weekends, but it was nothing like as bad as I'd expected before I joined. Everybody thinks Magic Circle firms and large US firms and huge English firms are going to be working you 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, but it's just not like that. It's only really when a deadline's coming up or something urgent comes in.
So would you mind telling us what was the reason you left Freshfields?
It was nothing specific about Freshfields. It was more just how kind of city law careers work. So I came into law older than some people. I was 28 when I started my training contract. I was 30 when I finished. And throughout that time, I'd just given a lot of thought to what my own personal priorities were. One of them was control, sort of control over my time and having better oversight over what was coming my way. If I booked tickets to something in a month's time, I want to know that I can definitely make that. Now, it's nothing to do with work-life balance. I work much longer hours now than I ever did when I was in the city. But if I want to take 2 hours off on a Tuesday morning to take my son to the park, or I want to commit to going to a football game I've been looking forward to, I know I can absolutely do that. And I can decide to then work until 2 a.m. in the evening if I need to make up for that work. So control was a big one, partly influenced by the fact that my son was born right at the end of my training contract. I wanted to be there at the important times and not miss anything. The second thing for me was impact. So for some people, impact is working on a huge deal that makes the front page of the Financial Times, dealing with these really famous companies that everyone has heard of and seeing all this kind of commercially sensitive information. And that's totally fair enough. That is huge impact. So dealing with hundreds of millions or billions of pounds worth of deals. The Financial Times is huge, and seeing deals in there can be a real thrill. So I totally get that. But for me, impact, I realized, meant something different. For me, it was directly seeing the impact that my advice and my contribution was having on the client. And I just couldn't see that impact when there were dozens of lawyers around the world all working on the same deal or the same case. Nowadays, when I am practicing as a lawyer, I work with startups, and I'll be generally the only lawyer working directly with the founders of that startup. If I help them raise money, or I help them hire their first employee or something like that, I can properly understand the impact that my interactions with that person has had. And that's why I left to focus on working on my own small businesses and working with other small businesses in both a legal and a kind of creative and commercial capacity.
So could you give us like a quick insight on how the Commercial Law Academy works?
Sure. So for a number of years, I've run a publishing company, which I set up quite by accident. Through that, I published my commercial law handbook, which kicked everything off, and then handbooks relating to other city careers and applications, interviews, a legal practice course revision guide, and then more recently, one focused on kind of everything I learned throughout my training contract and practicing as a lawyer, so a lot more technical. But it's always been print books. And as I've picked up more of a following from kind of potential international readers, I've got loads of messages saying, postage will take weeks, or the postage costs are really expensive. Is there a way of accessing that content instantly and much more cost effectively? At the same time, I was also very aware that things are becoming more digital. People want to be able to access resources on their phone, on their laptops, on the go. And that seeded the idea in my head of building an e-learning platform to kind of complement and expand upon the content in my books. Problem is, building an e-learning platform takes hundreds of hours, and that's hundreds of hours of totally unpaid work in the hope that one day people will find it useful. So it took a huge amount of time to kind of curate and put together all the video content, design practice psychometric test questions and commercial awareness quizzes and all the materials I needed. But really put my head down last year and managed to create all of that content. I'm still building new courses and new content, and it will always be evolving. But it's ended up as this kind of comprehensive e-learning platform for aspiring commercial lawyers with hundreds of videos and articles, quizzes, practical tips, flowcharts, downloadable e-guides, all that kind of stuff. And I've also brought in a lot of guidance from kind of friends who are more senior city lawyers, other qualified lawyers, industry experts, make sure the content is as relevant and accurate and helpful as possible. I guess one of the things that I hope really makes it different is content all being created or curated by me based on my experiences training and practicing as a lawyer and sort of coaching, mentoring and training thousands of students. So I've lived through these processes, which I think qualified me to then talk about more technical concepts like private equity. In terms of what it covers kind of everything you need throughout the recruitment process. So writing application questions, networking in LinkedIn, preparing for assessment centers, psychometric tests, practical commercial awareness. I go through a couple of my own interview case studies to show what can come up and how you can answer those, talk about what training contracts involves, what firms do on transactions, growth mindset and personal branding, setting up a business. I'm looking at a module on law firm insights right now, and I'm sure it will continue to grow. There's also a lot of stuff in current affairs. So I've started recording monthly webinars with Watson's Daily, which give a wrap up of what's happened in the previous month from like a business, legal and markets perspective. So all the recordings then kind of go up there. So that's where it came from. That's what it does. And I'd love anybody watching this to just to check it out.
Brilliant. So what would you say the biggest challenge, what are the biggest challenges you faced whilst building the Commercial Law Academy?
So I guess aside from creating all that content and trying to find ways to explain quite complicated topics or confusing topics in the most simple ways, a big challenge was finding the most effective way to structure that huge volume of content so that aspiring lawyers at any stage of the recruitment process could easily sort of identify and access the guidance they need. I think I've come up with a structure that is really clear, taking them through from the kind of earlier steps of their career journey, and a module focused on that, almost chronologically through all the different things they need to do to prepare. And I do plan on writing a bit more guidance around the order people can do courses in, but I think just categorizing everything and making everything available as part of one kind of overview subscription has hopefully kept it as simple and easy to understand as possible.
Perfect. So those are all the questions we have for this segment. I'll pass it on to Wafia so she can ask you a bit more about your achievements.
Thank you, Khadija. Now, looking at all your accomplishments and experiences, what is something you have accomplished you never imagined you would have?
So I think back when I was in a band and I just didn't know how to act professionally or write professional emails or anything like that, I wouldn't have believed you if you had told me I'd become a best-selling author, let alone the founder of a successful educational company. It was just so far removed from what I was doing back then. It's been the culmination of a decade of baby steps. It's like so much trial and error, you're getting things wrong all the time, being resilient, trying to figure out new ways to do things, and personally investing thousands of unpaid hours of work in the hope that it would kind of one day pay off and one day people would like what I was doing to get to where I am. So I think, and the best-selling author point only came very recently, you know, almost 7-8 years after I released my first book. So yeah, it's got to be that. And I'm still amazed every day that I get to work for myself and work from home and be around my family, and people are still reading what I'm writing and watching my videos, which is wonderful.
That's wonderful. On to you, Khadija.
Thank you, Wafia. So let's go into the more broader aspect of this interview. With the COVID situation, how do you think the legal sector has been affected in the past year?
So I think the pandemic has resulted in a load of challenges for firms. I think initially there will inevitably have been a reduction in large-scale M&A and other transactional work that corporates and financial sponsors typically engage law firms to work on, although it seems to be a lot more positive now. Kind of linked to that, we've seen some corporate and finance lawyers transitioning into restructuring and insolvency roles, using their transferable skills to kind of learn new areas of commercial law, where there is a bit more demand. The pandemic has also resulted in lawyers who are, you know, traditionally very much office-bound people transitioning to fully to remote working. This seems to have actually worked pretty well to date, but I think there are a number of challenges this poses and might continue to pose in the longer term, especially as firms seem to be open to sticking to some level of remote working long into the future. To give some examples, it might be harder for firms to adopt procedures to maintain client confidentiality, especially where lawyers live with friends or family members. I mean, it's almost impossible to stop people overhearing phone calls. You know, who knows what goes on with smart devices like Alexa and whether they're automatically recording and all that kind of thing. So it's something firms will need to think about. I think supervising and training new recruits in a remote environment is also quite challenging, especially given the large number of trainees who have never visited their offices or met their supervisors in person. I mean, this means that, you know, junior lawyers lose direct access to experienced colleagues, which can make it more difficult to learn on the job and build rapport. And when you build a rapport with someone more senior, that can make you feel a lot more comfortable asking questions. That can help you to learn from them. So I think that is a challenge. It'll also be more challenging for lawyers to collaborate in large teams and maintain sort of a positive, supportive firm culture. And people have said in the past, when they're working until 4 or 5 a.m. right at the end of a deal, the adrenaline keeps them going. And I think that adrenaline is fed from personally being around team members who are also working towards the same goal and being able to have a laugh whilst you're working. And I think a lot of that stuff is just doesn't exist so much at the moment. However, the shift to remote working does present a real opportunity for firms to cut costs by reducing their overheads, which can make firms more profitable. And a number of firms have already taken action in this regard. So I've read about some firms scrapping plans for big, shiny new offices. I've read about some firms now deciding to sublet some of the space. And some firms are paying tens of millions of pounds in rent a year. So knowing they can trust the workforce to work remotely and the clients are okay with that means in the longer term, you could see firms becoming more profitable.
So what tips would you give students and professionals who are appearing for virtual interviews?
So I won't cover things like how to answer competency questions and motivation questions, all that kind of stuff, because that answer would be an hour long in itself. But in terms of some practical tips, whether it's a virtual interview or a kind of Zoom networking chat or something like that, firstly is check your settings. Like, you might have done 100 Zoom calls, but the settings when you join the call might be different depending on who's set that call up. So just know whether or not your camera is automatically going to be on or your mic's automatically going to be unmuted. I mean, there are a couple of times where I've jumped into a call assuming the video would be off, wearing like a snapback and Ray-Bans, lying in a hammock looking ridiculous, only to then realize my entire law firm is staring at me during a training session. Dress properly, dress like you would for an in-person interview from head to toe. I know people joke about wearing kind of pajamas on the bottom half and a suit on the top half, but you never know whether you might need to stand up at some point during a call. So I was delivering a webinar to maybe 800 people, and my wife's phone kept ringing in the office just out of my reach. I couldn't stand up to turn it on silent because I was wearing bright pink flamingo swimming trunks. I had a friend that was on a work call. I won't say what they were or weren't wearing on the bottom half, but they forgot partway through the call that they were on video and hadn't dressed properly, and stood up to go pick something up in full view of their team. This stuff can happen. In one of my interviews, it was in person, but I kept getting asked questions about how I organize myself. And in the end, I said, look, in my bag, I've got my task list and I've got my diary. Would you like me to get it and show you? And the interviewer said, yeah. Now, in a virtual setting, let's say I had a similar thing I could have done and shown to the camera. If I had something ridiculous on my bottom half, there's no way I would offer to then go up and get it. So that's just my few anecdotes about dressing properly. Think about your setting. So find somewhere that's quiet and private and well lit, and think about your background as well. Make sure it's respectable and clutter-free. There are no ridiculous posters of a dog with a cigarette in its mouth, or nothing offensive, because that can be quite distracting and reflect on you. And if your background is chaos and clutter, that might reflect on your kind of organizational skills and might suggest you're a bit chaotic. So think about that. Make sure everyone in the house knows you are interviewing. Otherwise, they might just burst in saying something ridiculous. Now, I once was working in my kitchen with clients, and a friend who had taken the day off work, I didn't even know, just rocked up at like 11 a.m. on a Tuesday holding a couple of beers, being like, let's have a drink. And that probably made it look to my clients like I just spent every Tuesday morning drinking. But I mean, there's nothing you can do about neighbors, but just make sure people in the house know. Shut out your pets as well. But also understand that firms understand that things will go wrong in a virtual setting, right? If a dog runs in barking, or if I'm on a webinar and my toddler runs into the room, just try and laugh it off, kind of apologize for the interruption, and don't let it throw you off from a mindset perspective, because actually, we're all human and firms are fine with that. Think about your internet connection. So try to make sure no one in the house, yourself included, are streaming Netflix and Spotify and things that might make the internet a little weaker for the call. Try and sit as close to the internet router as you can. Another point I learned from firsthand experience is just make sure you have closed any programs that give you notifications. So on another webinar with about 600 people, I left my browser open with LinkedIn on it. I think I'd left my emails open as well. And throughout that webinar, every 2 to 3 seconds, I got a notification saying somebody had connected with me on LinkedIn. Now, you might think, well, just ignore the notifications, but we're all trained nowadays to see a notification, focus on it, start thinking, what does that mean? What does that person message me? What does that person do? Why have they connected with me? And it's totally distracting. So make sure everything like that is closed. Make sure that if you've got WhatsApp for desktop, that is shut. Maybe have your phone off rather than just having it on silent. So I don't know if this is just an Apple thing, but I've got an iPhone and a Mac. And I remember during another webinar, my mum called. My phone was on silent, so I was like, that's fine. But then the call automatically transferred to my laptop and started ringing. And then I was trying to make sure I didn't accidentally press accept, so there weren't 600 people listening to a conversation between my mum and I. But yeah, this stuff can go wrong, so make sure it's all shut. Another practical tip, if you're taking notes throughout, use an old school pen and paper. If you're typing, firstly, it can be really loud if your keyboard is near to the microphone on a computer, but it might also give the impression you're trying to Google an answer or Google some kind of help, which won't look great to an interviewer or someone you're networking with. So stick with that. Test the quality of your audio. If your microphone isn't great, or there's loads of external noise, or there's a chance if you're living next to a road, there'll be sirens and that kind of thing, maybe think about using a headset with a microphone. It could be better quality. It might zone out external noise, which will be less distracting for you, but also for the interviewer. I mean, I'm being a hypocrite because I'm not doing this with a headset, but I know this room is generally quiet. I mean, final point, and this is something I talk to the students I mentor about. Remember that your webcam lens is the equivalent of your eye contact. So it's so easy on a call to stare at the person talking to you, or to stare at yourself, see how you're coming across. But if you're staring at the webcam, and now I'm saying this, I'm much more consciously staring at the webcam, that can help you to build a rapport with clients. If you struggle with that, stick a Post-it note next to your webcam with an arrow pointing towards the lens, and that will continually direct your gaze back to where you should be looking at. Now, on that same Post-it note, if you find by recording yourself in advance you tend to speak too quickly, just write the word slow on that Post-it note. If you find that when you're nervous, you stop smiling and you come across as a bit, I guess, bored, not particularly engaged, draw a smiley face on the Post-it note as well. And those are the three things that people tend to do wrong the most in terms of their delivery. So smile, it changes the intonation of your voice, it makes you seem more enthusiastic. Remember to speak slowly so people can actually understand you, and remember to look at the webcam lens. So hopefully you find those tips helpful anyway.
I keep staring at the webcam now. But we know that you have been working towards building commercial awareness in students and legal professionals. Could you give our viewers some tips on how you would build on commercial awareness?
Sure. So like, commercial awareness was the aspect of interviews that most concerned me when I was a student. It was mainly because I just didn't know what it meant. If you don't know what it means, how can you possibly prepare for it? But I slowly realized, when you're preparing commercial awareness for an interview, think of it in these sort of two separate strands. One are these kind of internal micro factors that affect specific businesses, the risks those businesses face, how they raise finance, why one business would buy another. That's kind of strand one. The second strand is all the external high-level macro factors that affect businesses and industries in general. And that's where current affairs and industry trends and news developments come into play. And the two are interlinked, because if you're advising a business on how to raise finance, you need to understand the different options, but you also need to understand broader investor sentiment and kind of what's going on in the world that might affect that business's ability to access that finance. It gives you context. So we've got those two strands, and you can prepare for them in different ways. That first strand is what my books are generally aimed at, the kind of technical, commercial, business, finance, legal knowledge you need to tackle kind of commercial awareness case studies relating to kind of how businesses operate and what law firms do. And I cover a lot of that stuff in the academy as well. There's a brilliant book by an author called Christopher Stokes, who I've worked with a lot over the years, called All You Need to Know About the City. That was my starting point, and I learned so much about the financial markets and the key players, and I highly recommend that book. And if you guys are able to stick links up, I can send you a link to all of my recommended resources I'm talking about. So hopefully that will appear on the screen round about now, but his book is brilliant. Another way I learned a lot about how businesses operate, kind of relating to that first strand, is by reading company or founder biographies. I really enjoy learning about how a company was formed, how it grew, all the issues and risks it faced, how it overcame them. So I recommend that. Sometimes you feel a bit more like you're reading a kind of fiction story, but it's real and you learn a lot. The first book I read about that, and this is on that recommended resources page, is called The Upstarts by a journalist called Brad Stone. And this charts the journeys of Uber and Airbnb in tandem over the years, from the very early days where they're knocking around ideas and the Airbnb founders are kind of approaching different apartments in New York, trying to persuade people to list their rooms, right the way through to the kind of investment challenges, growth, regulatory challenges, and everything they went through to become these global tech superstars. If you like that, there's a book about Amazon, there's a book about Elon Musk. It's a fantastic book about the founding of Nike, written by Nike's founder, and that list just goes on and on and on. But that's kind of my recommendation. Another little tip, there's a website called Investopedia, which is full of the most brilliant definitions for technical concepts. And Investopedia has helped me out so much over the years when I've personally been trying to write about quite complicated concepts in simple ways. Now, moving to that second strand of commercial awareness, the whole external macro factors that affect businesses and industries. I like to use this analogy. Like if you pick up a big book, 500, 600 pages, and you read the first page, generally, you're not going to be gripped by that immediately. You're not going to be totally sucked into the book because you've got no context. You don't understand the characters, the history, their journey, how bits of story are tied together. You don't really understand the meaning of the words on the page or what they're leading to. Once you're 100 pages in or 200 pages in, assuming it's a good book, that's where you get really sucked in. That's where you start to understand how everything ties together and how kind of one story evolves. And commercial awareness, or I guess reading about current affairs, isn't a million miles away from that. If you feel guilty about your lack of commercial awareness and once a week you read a random article from the Financial Times, you're never going to be able to understand kind of what makes that interesting or the wider context. But if you read about it every day, little and often, then you'll slowly start to build up a picture of how everything ties together and what's going on. And that's what makes it more interesting. And if you become interested in it, then you'll naturally become more confident talking about it. So what do I mean by little and often? Honestly, 5 minutes a day is probably better than a 20-minute intense reading session every couple of weeks, or it will be a lot better. And a way to train yourself to do that is to sign up to news digests. So The Economist has a brilliant free email digest summarizing the kind of 10 to 15 key political and economy related events from the previous week. If you're interested in tech and investment trends and industry trends, there's a company called CB Insights that does a number of free weekly digests. I read that every week because it's relevant to my tech clients and I like to keep abreast of what's going on in that industry. For general business news, I'm sure so many of the different news websites offer free email digests, so you can just check those out. And that can be a really great starting point. Now, if in an interview there's a risk that you're going to be asked to talk about a news story in more detail, then obviously a 10, 12 word summary of something won't be enough. Now, I used to use BBC Business News to trace the history of articles. I found the articles fairly short, concise, easy to understand, but at the end of every article, they had related links, which meant you could trace kind of different opinions around a story. You can see how long that story's been going on for. You can look at the earlier articles around the story, and that can help you to build up a more in-depth picture of what's going on, which can then help you to put together a 5 or 10 or 15-minute presentation on the story in case you need to do that in an interview. One final point here, if you are going to interview at a firm, check out the firm's website. It might have a blog portal or a client portal or somewhere where you on certain major current affairs, and that can be quite a safe way to learn how the firm talks about stuff in case you also need to talk about it. But I'll leave it there. I could go on for hours and hours, but hopefully that gives some tips.
Perfect. So I'll pass it on to Jishan now.
Thank you, Khadija. Definitely everything you've covered till now has been very thought-provoking and insightful. The COVID question especially was definitely, it was nice to see what it's like for the practical aspect, because obviously we only read about it in the newspapers. And the advice you've given is beyond helpful, I'm sure. If you could give a title to your life in a movie, what would it be? So this is completely up to you, right? It's not defined by anything else.
Yeah, I guess maybe something like Never Gives Up, Never Stops Trying. I mean, I've been rejected so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times for everything, like firm sponsorship when I was a student, funding for my businesses. I pitch for work every week. Sometimes I pick up work, sometimes I don't. But whatever goes wrong professionally, I will always try and see the bright side. I will always try and focus on the positives. Back when I was in a band, we used to pitch ourselves to random people in the street to try and persuade them to come see us live. Some people were lovely, some people were quite rude, but I think that's needed a level of resilience in me that I've been able to build upon over the last few years. I think if you're going to be self-employed, you're going to run your own businesses, you have to have that resilience, because if you take everything really personally and you linger on failures and you linger on things going wrong rather than constantly trying to improve, you're just not going to enjoy the journey at all. So I just try not to let that stuff get me down. I always try and find ways around setbacks, and I just accept now that is part of being self-employed and running businesses. And I realize that everybody goes through it, and the same goes for students applying for kind of legal roles and city roles and competitive grad schemes. Like, you see a lot of stuff on LinkedIn where people are shouting about their success. You've got to realize that it's a tiny percentage of people. Most people, including the ones that are successful, have been through so much rejection. Accept that that's part of the process. I've written books on how to get jobs, but I was rejected by more than a dozen investment banks. I can't even remember how many law firms rejected me at different times, but accept it's part of the process and just keep going through. And that resilience will hold you in good stead throughout your career.
This has definitely been a very wonderful take on what you define your life to be, and I think it's very inspiring. And I'm sure that everyone at Lawyered and our readers or viewers will definitely take away a lot from it. But then the last question I have is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to every future lawyer?
I think it would be keep an open mind. When you first start, or if you're doing an internship, the work can seem quite basic and administrative. There are times where I've spent days filing correspondence and just managing stuff and organizing stuff. And it's really important, if that's the case, that you try as hard as you can to see the learning opportunity in everything you're doing. If you're asked to proofread a 200-page witness statement or a 200-page sale and purchase agreement, it's really easy to think, well, I've been through so many years of study and jumped through so many hoops to get here. Why am I just proofreading? And that's the wrong attitude. The right attitude is, I've never seen a witness statement before. I'm really, really glad I've been asked to proofread this so I can familiarize myself with what these documents involve, how they're written, how they're structured. I'll have opportunities to ask broader questions to my supervisor about, why have we included this? What did the witness mean by that? That is all part of your learning curve. And what that means is, if in a few months down the line, someone says, actually, could you draft this section of a witness statement? You'll be a lot better prepared. If you're asked as step one to draft a witness statement, having never seen one before, you're far more likely to screw it up, feeling a bit more of a panic. So by remembering that and always thinking, whatever I'm doing right now, it's all contributing towards my learning, I think you'll demonstrate the mindset and the enthusiasm and the willingness to learn that firms are looking for. I probably wasn't that great at having that mindset during my training contract. It's only in retrospect that I realized all of that exposure I had to documents and processes, even from an administrative perspective, has totally shaped my ability to practice law more independently now.
Yep, that's definitely a very good way of looking at it. Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Khadija?
So this interview has come to an end. I would like to thank Jake for taking the time out of his busy schedule to answer our questions. I have definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure your advice is going to take many students a long way. I would also like to thank Jashan and Wafia for helping out with this interview, and I hope everybody has a lovely day.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Great question.
Thank you for being with us
Thank
today.
you.